Yo guys, what's up? You may be hearing FTL boss music, and that is because I cannot yet play the Warcraft 3 game music. You see, I have a problem. I have a lot to talk about tonight. I want to rate all the human units in a tier list. However, this human soundtrack is only 1 hour long. So the moment the sound starts, I have to start making my tier list. And I need to try and get it to fit within that hour. Or else, the final part of the tier list doesn't have any sound, any supporting Warcraft 3 sound. Because we all know, according to the rules of the tier list, you cannot replay a soundtrack for a second time. Alright, let's get ready. I want to tell you all about what are the best units in the human race and who do not deserve ever to be made. Y'all ready? Let's go. Alright, human tier list. We have, from the humble peasant to the militia, we've got the footman, the rifle, the knight, the priest, the sorceress, the spellbreaker, Dragonhawk Rider, Gryphon Rider, Mortar Team, Flying Machine, and Siege Engine. Flying Machine in Reign of Chaos used to be called Gyrocopter. The Siege Engine used to be called Steam Tank. But those names were changed after a potential legal dispute, and when Frozen Throne came out, Blizzard went further away from any units that might have any legal overlap with some of the terms that are used in other games and other franchises. So we lost some of our best names, like Wyvern or Wyvern for the Orc Air Unit and the Gyrocopter and the Steam Tank. Some of us still call it that way, so if I ever mislabel them, please don't get upset. There are double names known in many of Warcraft 3 players' minds. Alright, let's begin at the start. We've already done our undead tier list and we put Acolyte on tier S for enabling everything else. And although it's kind of a meme putting a worker unit at tier S, they truly are the underpinnings of our society. The worker class. And so we're going to put them on tier S as well. In fact, while Acolytes can unsummon buildings, Peasants also have an additional functionality because they can actually be the only worker that mass builds a single building. We call this power building, and even though I've already placed the Peasant, I'm still going to explain to you why power building is so incredible for Peasants. After all, there are some new tricks that were learned just in the last 2 years or so, which is crazy when you consider how long the game has been out. So, origin story. In 2003, in Reign of Chaos, before I was known by almost anyone at all except my own town and my own village, my own family, I was a Warcraft 3 player and a Warcraft 3 fan. And I joined Battle.net, like many of all of us, just to play games. I was not anything super skilled or anything known, and I just ended up going to the custom game section. But unlike many of you who mostly go there to play Dota and Tower Defense and Hero Line Wars and Legend TD, etc., I usually went to the custom game section to have a different experience of one-on-one melee, which is what I normally played on ladder. I don't know why, but I thought sometimes, I guess it was like the variant of unranked. Anyway, I joined this lobby that said 1v1 good player or whatever. And I happened to go into a game with a player called SK Insomnia, who was a known pro player back then. And, I was not. I just looked at the pros sometimes and I didn't think I will ever be a pro. So it was a one-on-one by Insomnia. He was a human player and he would end up winning World Cyber Games 2003 later. And it was on Lost Temple and he took 4 of his peasants and he turned them into militia. This is a known base defense mechanic that is part and parcel of the human race. Everyone has their own base defense, and turning peasants into militia is humans' defense mechanism. The only weird thing was, he was not being attacked. And so he took those 4 militia and they ran to the expansion. I laughed. I was wondering what the heck he is doing. He would do something that would later become known, or already was known, but not to me, which was called militia creeping. Militia, you see, have extra armor, 4 instead of 0 on the peasant, and they also have the same damage as a footman. So it's essentially, as long as they don't get hit, or they don't get hit much, you have the power of 4 extra footmen really early to do some creeping and get your expansion cleared more quickly. I had never seen militia creeping before, and my initial reaction was skepticism, and I thought that he was just taking the mickey. But that was the meta, and I didn't even know almost what meta is back then. He would then build a town hall at his expansion at tier 1 before teching up to tier 2 with those 4 peasants using the, known to me, power building mechanic. And I'd never seen an expansion go up so early. It was super coincidence that I would join a pro game lobby and that they would actually let me watch. And that's the first time I saw Militia. So where do I rank Militia? Militia are a on-demand Footman DPS unit that are still half-life of a Footman, a little bit more than half. They have more armor than a Footman though, so they're technically more efficient together with Paladin Holy Light than Footman. Let's say that if you could tank creeps with either the Militia or with a Footman, and you were having the intent to Holy Light them when they have exactly 200 points of health missing, which is what Holy Light level 1 heals, you would tank with a Militia instead of a Footman, because it has more armor, so it, absorbs more damage, and the healing is more efficient as a result. Militia are useful not just for creeping 1 or 2 or 3 camps in a game, but you can also pull them into the middle of the map or on your own half of the map anytime your opponent is looking to fight your army out in the open. They were also used very often to do tower rushes. Hell, just yesterday we watched a game of the best human player in the world right now, Fortitude, who played against Colorful, who is a top 3 Night Elf in the world right now. And he brought a couple of peasants and he would start leapfrogging towers, Arcane Tower, Guard Tower, right? And Cannon Tower even. And he would slowly start leapfrogging towards the Night Elf expansion, setting up a base. Militia can travel faster than peasants, so that helps to get across the map earlier to stage such kind of offensives more quickly and more surprisingly. So I'm going to go ahead and put Militia in tier A. The way that I see tiers is that tier S is something that is completely unmissable and also best in slot. Tier D, may almost never want to use, is practically useless, does have some niche uses, maybe not entirely useless, but almost always disappoints. D for disappoint. C is for counter. They're counter units, they are not ubiquitously usable, they're not so versatile to always fit into any army composition, but you'll have them as a counter unit. Relatively niche, C for niche. And then B is just sturdy, right? Sturdy, average, a good unit, is not overpowered or anything. Most people won't complain that they are overpowered, but they just have their place, they're good, they're relatively mixable into many different situations and matchups. So, that's the Peasant and the Militia. Let's move on for next. B for balanced. Yeah, B for balanced. Okay, Footman. Footman is a very interesting unit. There are few units that are tier 1 that start to feel obsolete so quickly as Footman sometimes. You see, Footmen are especially specialized in one particular way, by design. They have a defend upgrade that makes them move extremely slowly at about 30-40% movement speed, but they also take only 30% damage from ranged piercing attacks. And that is pretty powerful. So let's take a look at the defend upgrade. Defend, piercing damage reduced by 65%. There's also a chance to reflect piercing attacks, in which case they take no damage at all, and they have 30% movement speed. So they become very slow, but they are very good against untargeted random attack fire from things like archers, headhunters. And it's also famously possible for a Footman to defeat a Wind Rider. The Orcish Wind Rider is low health and high piercing damage, so if it hovers over a peasant line with the intent to slowly whittle down peasants, and you put a Footman there, the Footman actually has a higher targeting priority. So unless the Orc painstakingly every single second clicks one of the peasants, it will automatically default its attack aggro to a Footman. So if a Footman with defense stands there, the Footman will win, because the amount of targeted return fires will actually kill the Wind Rider itself by its own damage. So that is a very nicely designed unit, in my opinion, that it is so good against piercing, but it does nothing against magic damage. A Footman defend does nothing against Sorceress magic damage or Gryphon magic damage, siege damage from the Mortar Team, siege damage from the Flying Machine. normal attack damage from the knight. It really just counters Rifleman and Dragonhawk Rider, and it cannot even attack Dragonhawk Rider. So when it comes to Human Mirror, Footman really only has purpose against Rifleman and Water Elemental. So a very narrow design range. The Footman nonetheless remains a quintessential unit because he is a gold-only investment of 135 gold to population. It produces fast, and it just adds extra units and damage. You could maybe make a game strategy where you only rely on Militia creeping early, but the main issue here is that you can only make one peasant at a time every 15 seconds. And so no matter how many peasants you try to make, you need a set amount for gold and you need a set amount for lumber in order to go to tier 2. Footmen are a nice throwaway unit. There's two ways to use them. Either you make between 3 to 6. It actually matters a lot if you make 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. There's many different layers of timings and strategies. I love how flexible it is. And the more you make, the more you're committing to early game skirmishes, raids on the enemy economy. Footman Defend is excellent against burrows, as they will take virtually no damage from burrow attack fire. So they're a great unit to support a large burrow raid, one of humans' favorite strategies to try and destabilize an orc player early game. So the more Footmen you see, the more aggressive the human is generally looking to play. Footmen sometimes are seen as a throwaway unit. You'll throw away Footmen because you want to replace them with higher value units, but always to achieve something. Either to buy time to get the towers up at your expansion as a human player, or to kill burrows, or to trade 5 Footmen away to kill a single Crypt Fiend, and you're okay with that because you have an expansion. So yeah, they're often thrown away. But sometimes you will see mid to late game Footmen that are still alive because the opponent is running a lot of piercing damage. Take a Night Elf player that goes 3 archers into 2 dryads into 4 bears. They have 4 or 5 ranged units with piercing that, should they randomly auto attack something in front of them, if that's a Footman, that just does nothing at all. The dryads are slowing themselves, the Footmen aren't taking a lot of damage, they're getting healed by priest. So Footmen do have a kind of mid-game purpose in a number of army compositions. Even though bears may be hitting the footies, those are really cheap units that stand in front and can help shield more vulnerable units such as Mortar Team, Sorceress, Priest, and Breakers and Rifles. So I think the Footman is an excellent unit. It's very well designed, fun to use. I would say they're just tier B. They're usually not OP because they die quite easily to units, but they're a true staple. A true middle tier unit, and that is my love letter to Footman. Alright, move on to the next unit, Rifleman. Riflemen are most comparable to all the other ranged units at tier 1 from the other races. Compare the Rifleman to an archer and a headhunter and a crypt fiend, and what do you find? You find something that is about the most average you can possibly have. Right? They haven't got web like fiends. They haven't got the raw damage output of a berserker from orc after turning on berserker upgrade. They haven't got troll headhunter's regeneration rate that rapidly regenerates them in and out of combat, and they haven't got the extreme range of an archer. And I don't know what the damage per population is, but I think archers are higher than riflemen. So they do not excel in any direction. Their base range is 400 and it goes up to 600 with an upgrade. Archer's base range is 500 and goes up to 700 with an upgrade, if I'm not mistaken. Or maybe it's from 600 to 700. Either way, they get outranged, they get outwebbed, out-regenerated and out-DPS'd by all the other units. And yet, they're not the worst in any category either. Headhunters have the fewest health points. No, sorry, let me rephrase that. Archers have the lowest health than headhunters, with rifles having more. They are more damage, I would say, than a Crypt Fiend by themselves, though I would have to test that. They have a nice health, they have a nice damage, they have better range than a Berserker with 600. And so the rifle is just perfectly average. It fulfills its job both against ground and against air. Because of its sturdiness, it doesn't as easily die to things like Shockwave Chain Lightning, Fan of Knives, Shadow Strike, or even some bears hitting them or some archers. They can survive a number of things. At 3 population per unit, a bit of tankiness would be expected. I think they fill that gap pretty well. Their attack lands very quickly because they're shooting a gun, not shooting a bow. Lands a little more quickly than the other ranged units, with the spear, the little spider cluster that fiends throw, and the archer bow. So just a good all-around unit. Rifles can counter various air. They'll do good against wind riders. They get countered only by high-level heroes, not low-level heroes, in terms of splash damage and direct damage. And they can even work against ground, which technically rifles should not work against tier 3 heavy melee. You don't think of abominations, knights, and torrents and then say, I'm gonna make riflemen against them. But it has always worked anyway. Rifles have always been used against all the tier 3 heavy melee anyway, because range is pretty good in Warcraft 3. I would hesitate to put them higher, but I don't think rifles are the epitome of the human peak performance, and this is not what human peak performance looks like. It's just good guys. Now they're not humans, of course, they're dwarves, but they're part of the human alliance. Okay, next, knights. Where does the knight go? With 5 baseline armor and a very high movement speed of 350, which is the same as a raider, knights are a tanky and fast tier 3 melee unit. Tankier in terms of armor than every other tier 3 melee unit, except maybe Mountain Giant. High armor does not mean tanky, not without health. Tankiness and high effective health is a combination of armor and health together. What high armor means, for the most part, besides the eventual effective health that they achieve, is healing efficiency. So knights perform well with Staff of Sanctuary, priests, Inner Fire, and also Holy Light and Heal Scrolls. So they do really well with all of those. They're a great tank, they're fast, that means that they can occasionally harass worker lines and come back and run away to live to tell the tale. They have pretty good damage. They have an upgrade that is Sundering Blades that is automatically researched in one patch, and in another patch that's coming out soon might need to be researched again at a small cost. But Sundering Blades further increases their bonus damage against medium armor, which is something that knights already have. Just like anyone with a normal attack damage, including Footman and Spellbreakers, they do bonus damage to things like Rifleman, and with the speed that they have, they're actually good at connecting with those units. Even Crypt Fiends that may get armor from the Lich Frost armor, even though knights get slowed from that, their high movement speed still allows them to close the gap a lot better than otherwise. Are knights going to beat out equal population and investment of torrents? No. Will they do that against bears? Sadly, no as well. Bear Roar and Rejuvenate puts them over knights in a direct confrontation. Will knights beat abominations? Well, it's not a fight I often see, knights versus A-bombs, but I'd say knights probably win. They're less affected due to their high health pool and their population density by disease cloud than many other units, and I think their armor and damage value for what you're getting is better as well. Further combine it with Devotion Aura and Holy Light, and I think knights are going to be doing pretty well against abominations. But overall, they're not the best tier 3 melee unit in any regard. Bears do more damage, torrents do more damage, but again, like the Riflemen, they are quite stable in every regard. I would go so far as to put Knight also in tier B. Naturally, as a tier 3 heavy melee unit, they get countered by air units such as Gryphons, Frostworms, and Destroyers, but not as quickly as some others because they can outrun and they have high health and armor, so they can get away from those. I think Knights are tier B. They're not something where you say like, oh my god, they're so broken, but they're really, really solid. I would say they're probably at the top of tier B or bottom A, so I'm going to place them right here. Okay, next, Priests. Priests are an interesting unit. They come with a spellcast that can be auto-casted, which is Priest Healing. For a very small count of mana, they can heal 25 health. I think it's 5 mana, 25 health. 5 mana, 25 health every 1.1 seconds at a range of 25, which is really, I think it's more than that. I think they mean 250. They calculated different. 25 is less than melee in Warcraft 3. I would say range 250. That seems about right. So where does Priest go? They provide healing and they enable vast amounts of strategies. Healing heroes, healing rifles and knights has often been common, and priest breakers. We take a look at Human Mirror. Priests and Spellbreakers are the two staple units in Human Mirror. This is because getting both of them at tier 2 is a lot easier than going to units that counter them. So what counters Priest Breaker? Generally, Knight Mortar Team. The coolest Human Mirror way to play is Knights and Mortars. SK Insomnia developed this style in 2003, and it has always been a very powerful strategy in Human Mirror. The problem is, going to tier 3 is usually a luxury that in a high octane 1v1 competitive game of Warcraft 3 you cannot afford. Not being able to go there because someone else hits earlier timings and is disrupting your economy, killing you, out-creeping you, out-map controlling you, it makes it so that Knights and Mortars feel unreachable in Human Mirror. So instead, you go to the next best tank. Footman is the first tank, then Spellbreaker, then Knight, and then literally Siege Tank. But we don't count them, except for memes. So you go to the intermediate tank, and instead of the Mortar Team, you start adding Priests so that you can keep them alive. So Priests are a staple unit in Human Mirror, together with Breakers. Dispelling water elementals and healing themselves and breakers, whereas breakers are damage, mana burn and tankiness. How about the other matchups? How important are priests against Night Elf, for instance? Well, I'd say very key. Usually against Night Elf, human will try to launch an offensive with Peasant, Militia, Footman, Rifleman, Priest, Breaker, Mortar Team and Sorceress. So basically every ground unit you can make at tier 2 is made against Night Elf, most commonly. Priests are an absolutely essential part of that, and for that reason I am going to put them on tier A. I almost could see them on tier S, but are priests broken? They're relatively vulnerable and they can be taken down by a number of spells. They are vulnerable in their low health class. They are unarmored, they take bonus damage from piercing as a result. They do nothing against air in terms of damage. They cannot fend off or defeat anyone. They have a very small amount of damage, which makes their attack voice line so funny. By the holy light, burn! They're not burning anyone. But yeah, I think that's gonna be a tier A unit most likely. So, next up, Sorceress. Very interesting. Where does Sorceress go? Sorceress has an incredibly powerful debuff. Also on autocast, a very cheap spell that slows enemy movement speed and attack speed, and lasts a good while as well. 50 mana, 700 range, 55% move speed reduction and 25% attack rate. Sounds about right. Lasts for a minute on units, which it's just insane. When you think of like MOBAs and how long debuffs on enemies last, 60 seconds for a slow? What were they thinking? You know, until recently, which is the last 6 years, until recently, Fairy Fire from Druids of the Talon lasted 2 minutes on units. 2 minutes. And if you think that's crazy, in Brood War, Parasite Vision from Queen lasts forever, right? Doesn't it last forever? I think so. You just have to kill the unit, right? In Brood War. But anyway, this is about Warcraft 3. And 2 minutes is pretty long. But anyway, 1 minute slow is pretty crazy. Where does Sorceress go? Besides slow, she has decent damage. A little bit more than the Priest. And then she also has invisibility, which can be counteracted with detection like Dust of Appearance, Sentry Ward, Scout Owl. So there's a number of ways to see detection, but as we know, oftentimes people do not know that Invis is going to be used until the first time it's used. Then they'll try to prepare for it. So the first time you do try to use invisibility, it's most likely going to save every unit that you have mana to cast Invis for. And that is when it's used as a save in combat. There are other creative applications of invisibility. You can invis a Footman and send it to track an enemy all around the map so that you can see every time, everywhere where they are creeping. And unless your Footman accidentally blocks them and they feel that there is a aberration in the matrix and they feel they just passed around something invisible and they do a sixth sense, I see invisible people, and they do a sixth sense dust of appearance and they find the footy, then you're gonna see everything about where they are. I have sometimes noticed one of my items go missing when I'm creeping, and I would instantly hit dust as a result, and a Footman with backpack was running away with an item in his grubby little hands, only for me to stop him and say, not so fast, get over here, and snare and take him down and reclaim the item. There's lots of cool applications of invisibility. You can also send in 6 Mortar Teams together with an Archmage and TP and to blow up someone's main base before they react. There's a lot of cool things you can do with them. And then you've got Polymorph, the master training upgrade that unlocks at tier 3 that turns a unit into a hapless critter. And in the new patch will even work on heroes for a few seconds if they keep that change. But as of yet it doesn't, and this tier list isn't about the new patch. And as of right now, Polymorph does not see much application in one-on-one melee. It is an expensive spell that can be dispelled, and usually you don't have that many sorceresses in a standard one-on-one game of Warcraft 3. So where do I rate this unit? She is a staple addition against Night Elf to slow down Demon Hunter and Bears. She's a staple addition in many games against Orc to slow down the Grunts, Raiders, the Tauren Chieftain, and to have some more control there. She does not see a lot of play against Human, because Spellbreakers, with their spell steal, can steal your debuff and put it on you. So anytime the opponent goes Mass Breaker Priest, there's no point at all to go Sorceresses, as you'll just be slowing yourself. I don't remember casting slow on you. And so, Sorceress, does she get used against Undead? Well, sometimes. Destroyers counter her pretty hard, but sometimes you have human players that can make a whole squadron of flying machines that can remove the chance for destroyers even to play the game, because flyings counter them so hard when they have no mana and when they're in too small numbers. That does require you to have an Arcane Sanctum though, and usually human is going 1 or 2 Barracks Knights, 1 or 2 or 3 Workshop flying machines, and they're combined Knights and Flyings. Occasionally that is combined with 1, 2, 3 Spellbreakers, both to help against the possible inclusion of Banshees and Banshee Curse, as well as to burn a little bit of extra mana on some heroes that you're attacking, and also to maybe control some other buffs or debuffs that could be happening, like Protection Scroll perhaps. But usually there isn't a lot of space to crank out a couple of Breakers, couple of Priests, and a couple of Sorceresses. And if you were to choose between any of those in a standard game of the current meta of Human against Undead, I would say Sorcerers are not the first inclusion when you're considering Arcane Sanctum units against Undead. I think you would first go Breakers, as they're magic immune and cannot be Coil Novad. Then Priests, so that you can heal outside of combat. Then Sorceresses, so you can slow inside of combat. You see, Priests have creeping value and sustenance value outside of combat. Anytime you rely on Priests and Sorceresses against Undead inside of combat, which is the only time Sorceresses do almost anything against Undead, right? Because they're not healing out of combat, they rely on PvP in order to get the value of their spells, unless you count Invis shenanigans. You run the risk of getting Coil Novad. Priests and Sorceress will die to a single Coil Nova, and sometimes Undead will just keep doing that to pick off one unit at a time. And then it's better to have Priests, so that a lot of the value that they accrued has already been spent outside of combat and healing. I think Sorceress is the last Arcane Sanctum inclusion against Undead, and as such, they're pretty rare. That makes them not very common against undead, though good if you have 1 or 2. I would place them in B or C for that. They are very key against orc. I would say sorceresses are tier S, A, probably tier S or A against orc. They're quite useless against human. You would only see sorceresses if one player goes Breaker Priest and the other does try to go Knight Mortar. In that situation, the Breaker Priest player would add sorceresses to help their breakers not die too fast to knights, and so that you can kite and cast Blizzard on the knights. That's probably what would happen in a human mirror. So they're a counter unit against human, they're a counter unit against undead, rare. They're extremely stable against Night Elf and Orc, and I would say you cannot even play against Night Elf without them, almost ever. So I'm gonna say I think sorceresses are also tier A, though in some cases they're tier C. I might just be inclined to put them in B, but they're so good in 2 matchups, it's hard to say exactly where they should be. I think it is correct to put them in B, not because they're ever B, they're either A or C, but because B is in between. B for between. Okay, next up, Spellbreakers. Where do Spellbreakers go? Spellbreakers are a direct result, alongside with Fairy Dragons and Destroyers, of a situation that happened a long time ago. This is even interesting because I believe the existence of Spellbreakers is partially decided by the very developments of the gaming industry. I know that's a little deep, but bear with me. In the past, expansions got planned, produced, announced, and made and released after a game achieved great success. It would then be the next thing you do, and you would start planning an expansion after your game succeeded, because the people want more. Nowadays, games come out by Paradox Interactive or Blizzard or some company. They're already thinking we're going to release 17 DLC or 3 DLC before the first game even comes out. So here's the 9 base units, and with the expansion will be 4 new races and 2 new units per race, and then there's another expansion and it brings another 4 races, etc, etc. So why am I saying all this? In Warcraft 3 Reign of Chaos, initially in the early part of Warcraft 3 Reign of Chaos, spellcaster units were insanely strong. Sorceresses and priests had piercing damage, not magic damage. And piercing damage related to armor classes differently than it does now. Essentially, piercing damage shredded everything so hard, everything that mattered so hard in Reign of Chaos, that all you had to do every game was make just priests and sorcs. Not only did they have all the buffs that they still have now, but instead of what they have now, 7 to 8 magic damage, or 8 to 9 magic damage, or 10 to 11 magic damage, they had like 15 piercing damage. So there were so many nerfs to casters at the same time that I feel like some of these anti-caster units are a little overblown in their value, because it was a knee-jerk response to the early dominant meta in Reign of Chaos. As such, this is why my wife says sometimes I beat around the bush and I need to get to the point about what I'm trying to say. That was a pretty long explanation for why I think breakers are OP. Breakers aren't just really strong against caster units, but they are also considerably strong tanks. They do good damage, they burn your mana away, they deal extra damage to anything that has mana. They are tanky in being a frontline unit, but having medium armor, which is more resistant to piercing damage than heavy armor. It is more resistant to magic damage than heavy armor. In fact, magic cannot even attack spellbreakers. Shamans, walkers cannot attack spellbreakers. Sorc, priest cannot attack spellbreakers, right? Stormbolt, Coil Nova. And then they have medium armor, so they don't even get kited and killed so easily by things like archers and berserkers, like a knight or a grunt might be. So they have so many things going for them, and they can steal your summons, give you your debuffs back, and also take your buffs. They shut down entire strategies and units just by existing. You cannot turn on Banshee Curse, Bloodlust. They will take your stasis wards, sentry wards, and heal wards with a flick of the wrist at 600 range. Right? Fairy Fire cannot be used against them. Now, they are just a really strong staple unit that sees play every time against Orc, sees play every time against Night Elf. It is 100% the main meta unit in Human Mirror, and against Undead, perhaps only, they see less play, but they are still the most popular Arcane Sanctum unit for human against Undead. I think they're crazy good. Spellbreaker tier S. Next, Dragonhawk Rider. Dragonhawk Rider design niche is to counter heavy air units, or at least something that is about as big as them. So how big are Dragonhawk Riders? Well, they have about 700 health, they are 3 population, and that makes them medium big. They're slightly smaller than a Wind Rider, who is 4 population and costs more gold, but they're bigger than a Gargoyle, who's only 2 population. They're much smaller than a Frostworm, who is 7 population, or a Chimera that's 5 pop. So why does it matter who is bigger or smaller, who costs more or less? Dragonhawk Rider has 2 special abilities. The first and most important one being Aerial Shackles. Aerial Shackle is a 40-second long channel that is a stun lock as they depreciate the health of the target that they are focusing at 30 damage per second. That unit cannot transform to Stone Form. In the case of a Garg, it can't fly away. It's locked in damage. 40 times 30 is 1200 damage. 1200 damage. That kills almost everything, though it does not quite kill a Frostworm. It leaves them very low. But while shackling the Frostworm, you can attack it with other things. That means that essentially, in most cases, Aerial Shackles is a death sentence. There are some counters though, quite a few. Ensnare counter Shackles, Stormbolt, Silence from Dark Ranger, Rockets from Tinker can stun them out of it. You can kill them, which stops the shackle, right? And there might be a couple of other things. You can staff a target away that's being shackled, but there's also some enablers to the shackle. For instance, if they're going to get ensnared or killed, you can banish them with Blood Mage so that they are an ethereal Dragonhawk shackling a real unit. An ethereal Dragonhawk cannot be ensnared and cannot be Bat Rider exploded upon. So in that sense, you can extend the shackle a bit. Outside of shackle, Dragonhawk have 2 purposes. They're a mediocre fighting unit, very comparable to the Scout unit from StarCraft Brood War, with a weak attack in general, though they have no bonus attack against air. They rely on the aerial shackles. So the Dragonhawk Rider will generally lose out in every single battle against ground units and air units. Dragonhawks do not beat siege engines with barrage. They do not beat flying machines. They will beat Gryphons if they can shackle them one by one, but not if they're attacking each other with standard cost. Like let's say if they can't use aerial shackles because they got interrupted, Gryphons beat them by health and damage. Dragonhawks will destroy Wind Riders with shackle, but would of course lose out extremely hard in a straight up battle that does not rely on shackles. They cannot beat rifles, headhunters, fiends, or archers. They can sometimes beat dryads, just like gargoyles, because of their focus fire potential, clumping up in air. And they're relatively tanky, so they are not as affected by dryad poison damage. But overall, they lose most battles. They exist for the most part as a counter unit that is almost never a staple. And I say almost because by and large, for the main 2 decades of Warcraft 3's existence and meta exploitation, Dragonhawk Riders were pretty much never masked as a staple unit. But I say almost because I did see it a couple of times by top Asian human players in the last couple of years. Someone would mask Dragonhawks For instance, Mountain King fast expansion with Footman and Militia against a Night Elf player that would go Warden and Archers on Terranus Stand, which is a map in the Warcraft map pool. And then they would go triple Gryphon Aviary Dragonhawks. Thorzane did this against Moon in the Warcraft Reforged Blizzard Invitational in 2020. Thorzane did it against Moon and almost won, but then the disconnect happens. And people said justice for Thorzane, but he lost the rematch. And the disconnect happened because Reforged desynchronized. Because it was new and buggy, and Blizzard is a small indie game studio that could not release a finished product. But those don't really happen much anymore. Only occasionally, only once or twice a month. And so almost never a staple unit, almost always a counter unit, valuable against heavy air like Frostworms, Wind Riders, and against Gryphons, and also against Chimera, but less valuable against small units like Bat Riders and Gargoyles, because Bats by cast should outmass them. If they get the Shackle earlier on Bats, that's great, you could still win. They're tanky enough to survive one explosion. If you split them and you eat some Bats with Shackle, that works. But in equal numbers, with Speed Scroll, Bats should win out against Dragonhawks. So I think they're a counter unit. They're useful, they should exist. I think they're correct where they exist as a counter unit, but not a staple, so tier C. Gryphon Aviary. Gryphons, also from the Aviary. Gryphon is a tier 3 heavy melee unit, and a tier 3 heavy magic unit that probably, I would say, is the most average solid air unit in the game. It does not have as much weaknesses as any other unit. Gryphon is much tankier than a Wind Rider, about double the health, but the same population and almost the same cast. Gryphon deals really good magic damage and will generally win out against Wind Riders just because they're so much tankier. Even though Wind Rider does piercing, which is a little more effective against light armor than magic, but they're just so tanky, right? They get an upgrade for health. Gryphons are more spammable and massable than Frostworms. They have a Stormhammer Splash upgrade that deals a little bit of splash against particular ground. It cleaves behind the main target. It helps them to beat ground-based units quite a bit. I think it's helpful. And that seems to be more splash damage than Worms generally achieve. They're more all-purpose than Dragonhawks, Bat Riders, Gargs, Hippo Riders. I think they're the most solid, standard air unit. They do not exceptionally excel in any particular direction, but they really just deserve to be tier B, because they are a unit that can be a staple unit. That you can just announce you're going, so to speak. You keep going it, then the enemy counters you, but you keep going for them anyway. I'll name some examples. Gryphons get countered by same cast investment of flying machines. Hard. How can you still go Gryphon against flying? Well, technically you shouldn't be able to, but Warcraft 3 is not just an RTS, it is also an RPG RTS. There are heroes. Any human player in Human Mirror that wants to go Gryphons will be sure to anticipate, if they are of high level, that they could face flying machines. So what do? You open Archmage so you can reskill to Blizzard that can kill flying machines in large numbers. You also go second hero, Pandaren Brewmaster, which is the best hero in the game sometimes against small air units. He's available from the tavern, so anytime you are planning to go Gryphons, you would go Archmage Panda. Gryphons also get countered by enough numbers of Bat Riders, and yet you can still counter the counter by upgrading armor, getting Devotion armor, Devotion aura from the Paladin, getting some skill points in that third aura ability on the Paladin. You can get Protection Scroll, Staff of Sanctuary, Heal Scroll, and Inner Fire. So there's so many ways to counter their counter there. And really, in Orc, there is no true hard counter for Gryphons. Small numbers of Gryphons can be tackled with Raider and Snare, Kodo and Shaman, and snare some, focus them down. But the moment that you get 6 to 8 Gryphons, usually ground-based Orc armies can no longer contend with Gryphons. And like I said, while Bat Riders in large enough numbers can counter them, Gryphons can continually creep with their excellent anti-ground damage. So long as you're not directly fighting against each other, a Gryphon and a Bat Rider army of equal investment The only thing the Bat Rider player can do is fight the Gryphons or kill buildings with liquid fire cheese. And so there's a lot more you can do with the Gryphons before the final fight. So while bats sometimes cost efficiently kill Gryphons and sometimes they don't, Gryphons are always useful and bats just exist until a fight gives them purpose. So that's already 2 units, Flying Machine and Bat, that can be countered simply by just building more Gryphons. So they're very, very solid. I'm not going to put them on tier A because you definitely can't make them every game and be super happy about it. But a well-crafted Gryphon strategy is solid. Approved. Next up, Mortar Team. Among the 4 long-range ground siege units, Glaive Thrower, Meat Wagon, Demolisher, who used to be called Catapult, and the Mortar Team. The Mortar Team is the only one that's biological. That means it can be healed by Priest, Regeneration Scroll. It self-regenerates via natural health regeneration, which mechanicals do not. So they'll never cost money in that way to be needed to be repaired by peasants. And that makes them special. They also have a special upgrade called Fragmentation Shards. Mortars do siege damage, which means they do bonus damage on unarmored units, such as priests and sorceresses. But the Fragmentation Shard gives them an extra special damage upgrade. They do damage in a larger area, with bonus damage attributed towards both unarmored armor class and medium armor class. Normally, siege damage does reduced damage to medium armor, but with Fragmentation Shard, they get back some of that damage that they would otherwise lose. So that makes them not just good damage dealers against sorceresses and priests, but also against riflemen and spellbreakers, as well as peasants without militia upgrade. So they go from 2 units counter in Human Mirror to 5 units. And of course the same thing works on headhunters and archers, talents and dryads. So they become much more useful. The amount of targets they can effectively kill just about doubles. Mortar teams can also be holy lighted, unlike mechanicals, so that's also useful. As such, Mortar is undoubtedly the best ground siege unit in the game that has range, not counting Raider, which we'll get to in the Orc tier list. That makes me feel like Mortar is tier A. However, keep in mind where siege units normally are. Normally, these kind of siege units are tier D. Meat Wagon, Demolisher, and Glaive Thrower are virtually unusable in any game. So we're not talking about an upgrade from average to extremely powerful. I gas these mortars up because they go from tier D to C or B. Can you make Mortar every game? I think you're always happy with Mortars against Night Elf. Almost always. They do bonus damage even on slowed bears that clump up. Even though it's not amplified damage, it's still a large amount of damage. Siege units like the Mortar and the Catapult and the Glaive Thrower have a relatively high value of damage that is missable because they have a projectile that takes a long time to land. So against fast moving unit like the Raider, Mortar generally has trouble hitting them. They also have min range. They cannot hit something directly next to them. So you wouldn't want to spam mortars against bears. It wouldn't do anything. You wouldn't even kill a single one. But in a large, versatile army, with priest, sorceress, breaker, footman, peasant, militia buffering, you want to have 1 to 3 mortars behind there to damage bears and to take down dryads from really far. You see, dryads also die very well to rifles, but rifles cannot sidle up close enough to dryads to actually take them down, because that would put them in the firing range of druids of the claw, bears. Mortars do have a range advantage, so they can fire away from the backline and still kill dryads. That is very useful. So you'll definitely use mortars against Night Elf, most likely. In any 2 versus 2 base game, you'll use mortars. If you're doing a 1 base rifle rush, perhaps not. Do you use mortars a lot against Orc? Not usually. Usually you'll spam Gryphons or Breakers against Orc, with a 3rd unit maybe being Rifle and very common inclusions being Sorc and Priest. We don't see as many Knights and Mortars against Orc. I'd say against Human Mirror, Mortar is tier C because it's hard to get to them. Against Orc, very unusual. Against Night Elf, staple. And against Undead, almost useless as well. So I think Mortar upgrades from tier D to C. Maybe low level tier B, but I really don't think they're staple enough in every matchup to be able to call them B. So I'm going to say tier C. Okay, we're getting down to the final two units, the mechanicals. And it looks like I didn't make it in time. The music ended. I will replay it. I will break my own rules. I took a solemn vow. So Flying Machine, where does it go? Flying Machine is a 1 population unit, which only the Shade and the Peasant and the other workers normally share. Every other normal fighting unit is 2 population or more. Flying Machine gets an upgrade, 2 upgrades in fact. One is called Flak Cannon. It takes their anti-air piercing damage attack and it makes it splash quite a lot in fact. Because of this, Flying Machines beat every single air unit in the game except the squad of Bat Riders. They beat everyone in large enough numbers. If we were talking about 100 population of Flying Machine against 100 population of any other air that is not Bat Riders, Flying Machines would win. And I would say that they may even win against bats, as crazy as it seems, if you have ChatGPT Micro. Right? Because 1 flying and 1 bat is a good trade for human. But I digress. Generally, the more flyings you have, the more air units you're countering, the better they get. They should not be a counter to Frostworms or Gryphons. When you think of their niche is supposedly attacking as many different targets as possible because of the splash of Flak Cannon. But they're just so efficient, they're so hard to take down all of them, that they tend to just win. Now, Flying Machines can lose to Gargoyles, because Gargoyles are also anti-air masters, and Hippogriffs, they can lose to Hippos because they're anti-air masters. But given enough numbers, like, yeah, 20 flyings may lose to 10 Gargs with certain hero buffs, but 100 flyings will beat 50 Gargs, for sure. It's just too much splash, everything dies. They're also the fastest air unit, so they will be able to outkite and outshoot everyone. Very useful unit. They will counter, in particular, Hippogriff Riders, Wind Riders, Dragonhawks, Gryphons. They will also, of course, counter Fairy Dragons, which are more of an anti-caster, not anti-air. They will counter Chimera, who cannot even attack air back. They should not, but do, counter Frostworms. And that's just their anti-air. Flying Machines can also get an upgrade, which is the bombs. When they get the bombs, they get a small siege damage, which is comparable to the Corruptor's anti-ground attack in StarCraft 2. When Flying Machines no longer have an aerial threat to cover, which is often, because Flying Machines always win the anti-air battle, including against destroyers. They're a very common unit, a staple unit against undead, in fact. Knight and Flying Machine is the staple strat right now against undead. When there's no more aerial threat, you can upgrade bombs and they can start doing ground damage. They will slowly kill priests with their siege damage attack, but they're nearly melee. It's like 150, 200 range maybe, their bombs attack. So you've got many, many, many flyings congregating around a single spot. It is very reminiscent of how it looks like, how Yellow Jacket hornets or wasps swarm around a hive. That's how it looks like when flying machines attack a sorceress. And like, yeah, they'll beat sorceresses, sure, but it still takes a while. And the more a unit moves, the more they try and catch up and fail to proc their attack. So they're really not a fighting unit against ground. They can, however, do a decent job at killing buildings. We've seen some flying machine massing strategies where you go 20, 30, 40, 50 flying machines and you start killing buildings. This is particularly useful against Night Elf players that go Warden but refuse to get a second hero, like Pandaren Brewmaster, which is what I did in a recent level 10 Warden game. If you want to see it, go to my Follow Grubby channel. Bing! Got the level 10 Warden game. There should be a tradition in all of my tier lists that I mentioned a level 10 Warden game. And then Flying Machines would actually be a pretty good option because Fan of Knives does not attack the Flying Machines. Only Fire Breath does. And Carrion Swarm, of course, and Rockets, but not Fan of Knives. So flyings can be your staple unit against Warden, as she cannot do much against it, and then they can just go kill the buildings. Where do flyings go? They're one of the best counter units in the game. They cannot win games by themselves. I'm gonna say they are... Essentially, they should be in tier C because they're a counter unit. But I feel like they're such a good counter unit. They do so well within the niche of what they do. I'm gonna place them in tier B. I cannot put them in C and say, well, sometimes they will do this niche thing. No, like they destroy in their category in what they do. If you go Wind Riders, you get a couple of flyings, you just end up winning the game because of it. It's insane how good they are within what they do. And they have detection too, they have true sight. That's true. They can see sentry wards and combined with the Spellbreaker control magic, and they can steal sentry wards. They can see level 3 Spirit Wolves. They see the Blade Master. So, very strong. Finally, Siege Engine. Ooh. Siege Engine used to be a 3 population unit, is now a 4 population unit. Siege Engine used to give 60 experience, same as a rifle. Now he gives 85 experience, same as a Wind Rider or a Wyvern. So they definitely did get nerfed. When they were 3 population, I would say Siege Unit was a tier B or even tier A unit. They won a lot of games against Night Elf and Undead by themselves. You would go Fast Expand, you would mass towers, and then you would make 3-4 workshop Siege Engines. They would just overrun the enemy base. Occasionally you would mix in some Knights and Gryphons, but Siege Engines won so many games. They used to be tier A against Night Elf and Undead. But that's not the case anymore. They now give more experience, they cost more population, and while Siege Engine does get a unit called Barrage, which gives them a firework of, I think it splits into 6 attacks against air. Upgrade time 40 seconds, Barrage, 25 damage piercing by the way, per hit for a range of 500. 9 rockets can be fired at once at the 2-second cooldown. So that is an insane anti-air attack. That means that just by punch, Siege Engines will destroy Gargoyles, Dragonhawk Riders, Wind Riders. They will even beat Gryphons. They basically beat any air unit except Chimera and Frostworms, just because that little bit of piercing damage is not going to take down those air units quickly enough, as that they will be taken down by those units. So Chimera, Frostworms are safe. You can just completely ignore the Siege Engine actually with those units. But if there are Barrage Siege Engines, you cannot take a straight up fight with Gargs, Wind Riders, Dragonhawks, Flying Machines, and I might be forgetting a couple of other units. You know, Hippogriff Riders, Destroyers. They will obviously defeat Destroyers, though any undead player that's worth their weight in salt is gonna ignore the Siege Engines and focus on other things. Because at the end of the day, except for units that are 600 HP or less in the air, any 601 HP plus unit is just gonna ignore them and kill everything else. So in that sense, even their anti-air attack, even though it's... and their tankiness with fortified armor, even though they should be able to win any battle, they will just be ignored. They won't even be looked at. Which is what I was at in high school when it came to girls. And that felt pretty tier D to me. Now, when it comes to tier C, are they a valuable counter unit? I would say not really. Like, what do they counter? Do they come out when the enemy happen to make buildings and you need to counter some buildings? No, everyone always has buildings. Do they come out to counter air unit? No, they're probably the 4th choice against air. First ones being Flying Machine, Dragonhawk, and Rifleman. So they're the last choice against air. They're not even the first choice against building, which is their niche. And while they do have a purpose, I'm gonna put them in the lowest of tier C or the highest of tier D. I think, honestly, they come out roughly the same time Demolishers come out, or Glaive Throwers. Glaives and demos are so bad, they only come out to counter Siege Engines. Meat Wagons come out to counter Siege Engine. So Siege Engine gets countered by tier C or D units. Like, what does that make him? I don't know. You'll see some Siege Engines against Night Elf sometimes. You'll see some siege engines against undead, but I think they're no longer spammed and massed with nothing else. Nowadays, you'll see 1, 2, or 4 to support a much more standard army. I think I have to put them in tier D. I can't see them any higher. I'm not even talking about them against human, because militia deal with them pretty well. Orc has the #1 predator of the prey of siege engine, and it's called Raider. Raider is about 1 million times as fast as a siege engine, and he can root the siege engine with a snare, and he has siege damage against their fortified armor. So as an orc, I've never had any problems with siege engine ever. Like, I've never lost a game, or I think even a building, to siege engine, except maybe an FFA. So yeah, human doesn't fear them, orc doesn't fear them. They see some use against undead and night elf, but it's so rare, and it's not usually many. I think it's C, but they used to be A. I could maybe put them in C, tier C, but I think you pretty much almost never see them much. And I'm not saying that they are useless. Generally, D should be reserved for almost useless, but I think they're at the top of tier D. And that is my analysis for human and the tier list of their units. I like doing these tier lists because it's not really so much about giving people a list of units you should build in your next game of Warcraft 3, but it's a great opportunity to just have a kind of a structured discussion style to talk about the game we all know and love. It's a nice opportunity to give some history on units and some use applications in both the current and the historical meta of Warcraft 3. Hope you guys enjoyed this one as well. Next up will also be coming at some point an Orc unit tier list and a Night Elf unit tier list. So if you liked this video, please let me know what you thought of it in the comments and hit that sub button. This is my fastest YouTube growing channel right now, which is super awesome. I really like making content for this one. I've got 3. One where I upload Warcraft 3, one where I upload Variety, and then this one here. So make sure to sub if you want to hear me waffle more while you do some walks in nature, or you do your cooking, or you are actively listening with your pen and paper out in order to take notes for your next preparation of becoming Warcraft 3 World Champion. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Cheers.